Thanks a lot, Emma. Thanks a lot for being here. I was very optimistic about that talk until a couple of minutes before, and now I'm not sure anymore. But let's hope the technique stays with us. What I want to do in that talk is a kind of conceptual analysis of the idea of optimism. I wanted to know what optimism is, and when you looked at it in the literature, both empirical and philosophical, there is very little on that. There is a lot of work in the philosophy of hope. When you look at psychological research, there is a lot of research on whether humans are optimistic, whether they are too optimistic or too pessimistic, whether optimism is good or bad for human, and that there is a lot. But of course, to address all those questions, we need to know what optimism is, and it's not as clear as what one may expect. And in fact, the kind of distinction I think we should introduce to understand optimism are reflected in that tree here. So the first distinction is a distinction between optimism as a character trait. So we might say Emma is optimistic, Damiano is pessimistic. This is just character trait of different persons. I won't focus on that here. I will focus on what I call attitudinal optimism. So the kind of attitude which we may call optimistic attitude, being optimistic about something, right? And the chief distinction I want to draw here are the three distinctions you have here. The first thing, and in the literature, this is what people most often, in the empirical literature, most often have in mind, is that to be optimistic is to have positive expectation about the future. So you think the future will be bright, okay? That's the most natural way. And the most general assumption among scientists working on optimism. Now, the first thesis I want to introduce here is to say there is a very I don't know if it's important, but it's very strong, at least, between factual optimism and focal optimism. Focal optimism is the idea very familiar to all of us of focusing on the bright side of things. And I want to say these two things are very little in common. So when we speak of optimism, in fact, there is at least that ambiguity. And the last thing I would introduce at the end of the talk is the idea of axiological optimism. And the idea here is it's a view about value who maintains that good is stronger than bad. That, I mean, it's weird to put that way. I mean, it's a bit elusive, and I will try to explain exactly what it means to say that good is stronger than bad, and how it relates to the other form of optimism. So let us start by factual optimism, and to try to define it correctly. So a first proposal to define factual optimism is the one you have here. S is optimistic that P, if and only if S believes or judges or thinks or feels any cognitive attitudes. I'm not I don't want to go into the details here. If S believes that P will probably be the case and that it would be good that P. Okay? So you think that something which is good will probably happen. There are many counterexamples to that, but one of the counterexample is this. So suppose that Jordan expects that university will expand over the next decade. So that satisfies the first condition. Suppose that it would be good that the university expand over the next decades. That satisfies the second condition. But in fact, Jordan thinks that universities are really bad, that they are detrimental to society. So he's not optimistic at all about that. Okay, so he thinks that something good is probable, but yet since it doesn't think that it would be good that university expand, he is not an optimistic about that. So the obvious fix here is to modify our definition that way, to say that S is optimistic that P, if and only if S believes that P will probably be the case, and second, S believes that it will be good that P. So the only modification is that the ascription of value is within the content of an attitude. Okay, be that belief, judgment, thinking, feeling, whatever. Okay, so that's better, but it still faces the following worry. It's assumed that optimism is always about the future, and that seems to be prima facie plausible. But in fact, it seems that there are also cases in which optimism is directed towards some events which are past. So suppose that Paul believes that he has succeeded at his exams, or suppose that he believes that his cat is still alive, or suppose that he believes that his grandmother didn't suffer, or suppose that he believes that he has won the lottery. In all these cases, he is optimistic about something which has already happened, right? So optimism is usually about the future, but not always about the future. And so what's really, how should we fix this? And my proposal here is to move to probability, to say that that's the first try. We get close to the correct definition. S is optimistic that P, if and only if S believes that it is probable that P. And second, S believes that it would be good that P. Okay. So probable here is supposed to accommodate both the kind of optimism about the past, which I just mentioned, and optimism about the future here. It's better, but we are not quite there yet. Now, here is a counterexample to that definition. Suppose that Paul thinks that it would be good that he does not die during the next months. That's satisfied as a second definition, and the second condition. And suppose as well that Paul thinks that it is probable at 70% that he won't die over the next month because he knows that he has cancer. Okay. That satisfies the first definition. It's probable that he won't die, and it's good, and he doesn't want to die, so he must be optimistic. But of course, if you meet Paul and he tells you there is 60–70% that I won't die over the next month, it does not qualify to be somebody who is optimistic. In fact, it's quite pessimistic to think that you have 70% chance of survival over the next month, right? I'm looking at him. I hope it's just because you don't understand, not because you think it's. So the point is, let me rephrase. So proposition: Paul believes that it is probable that P, and Paul believes that it would be good that P. Okay. In such a case, Paul believes that it is probable that he won't die. It thinks that the probability is 70%. So it's probable. Okay. It's more than 1 chance over 2. It's probable that satisfies the first one, and it's good. He doesn't want to die, so for him it's something good. So we should diagnose him as an optimistic about his chance of survival, which is clearly not the case. I mean, intuitively not the case. And the fix here, it's a lazy fix, but I think this is the way to capture it in language. Just to add that small magical word is here is just to say that. For being optimistic, you have to expect of something which you take to be good that it is probable enough, okay? And then we have to specify what is probable enough, and probably it's going to be dependent on the context, the peculiar situation. I'm not going to enter that question here. So this is my final proposal for defining the first kind, the most general way of understanding what optimism is. S is optimistic that P, if and only if S believes that it is probable enough that P, and the enough clause is also necessary for goodness here. S believes that it would be good enough that P. For similar reason, if you just expect the movie to be okay and not very good, you're not very optimistic about your evening. So that's the proposal to define factual optimism. Now, if you look at it, what's important is that it consists of 2 beliefs here, or 2 cognitive attitudes, which have a propositional content. And this is the reason why I call it factual. That is, if you are a factual optimist, you have beliefs about what is probable and belief about what is good. And that means that the factual optimist and the factual pessimist, they stand in factual disagreements with each other. They disagree either on what is probable or on what is good. So for instance, the optimist who thinks that illiteracy will decrease and the pessimist who thinks that illiteracy will increase, they have a non-evaluative disagreement here, but they both agree that illiteracy is bad. Okay, so they agree axiologically, but they disagree about what is probable, what is future in that case. But you may have the reverse situation. The optimist who thinks that immigration is increasing and that it is good, and the pessimist who thinks that immigration is increasing and that it is bad. They agree about the non-evaluative facts. They agree that immigration is increasing, will increase, But one thinks that this is good, the other thinks that this is bad. So the disagreement here concerns the second condition, the evaluative beliefs here. So the key point here is optimism and pessimism, as they are standardly understood, and this is perfectly okay in the literature, they concern facts, and they concern two kinds of facts: non-evaluative facts and evaluative facts. And when you disagree on one of those two kinds of facts. Okay, so that was my attempt at understanding factual optimism, and now I move to focal optimism. That was supposed to be a very fluid animation. Moving. Okay, so focal optimism. Okay, let us start by a small dialogue I discovered in an old library between Schopenhauer and Leibniz. So they had the following exchange, which is a high piece of literature. So they're in the front of a glass, and Schopenhauer starts by saying, half of the glass is empty of wine, half of the glass is full of wine. Leibniz answered, absolutely, they agree on the amount of wine in the glass. Nothing is better than wine, nothing is worse than lack of wine. I couldn't agree more. They agree on the fact, the amount of wine and the value of the wine. But now comes Schopenhauer pessimism. I can't forget that lack of wine. And Leibniz answer, I can look away from this bone Romanet. So they focus on this part of the glass, but they agree on the fact, not just the non-evaluative fact, but also the evaluative fact. Okay. That's the basic reason why it's not factual optimism. And that's when we speak of optimism or pessimism, there is that big ambiguity. Are we speaking of a factual disagreement, or are we speaking of a different way of focusing on the same facts that we all agree on by a hypothesis here? So the factual optimist and the factual pessimist disagree either about what there is or about the evaluation of what there is. But now the focal optimist and the focal pessimist are in factual agreements, both about what there is and about the value of what there is. But the disagreement, if it is one, it's not a factual disagreement. There is a question of whether we should speak of disagreement here, but at least there are different attitudes and which are opposed. So let us use disagreement in a loose way here, right? So how should we characterize focal optimism now? Here is the first try. I will make it a bit more encompassing a bit later on, but I will be working with that definition for a while. So let's say that S is optimistic about X focally. If first S believes that there is as much goodness and badness in X, and second, S focuses more on X good aspects than on X bad aspects. Okay, so you believe that there is as much goodness and badness in the glass, but you focus on what is good. Okay, you don't focus on goodness. That's an aside, but the idea is that we generally do not really attend to value. We attend to the things that have value. So you don't focus on the goodness of the wine. You focus on the wine if you are optimistic, and if you are pessimistic, you focus on the lack of wine in virtue of its badness. But this is really on the value bearer that you attend, to the value bearer that you attend. So now the key problem here, not a problem, but the key question is, what do we mean by focusing? Okay? Focusing is not a difference of content in the attitudes, because we can, or two optimists and pessimists may have the same content. So what do we mean by focusing? Here are a few ways of trying to make sense of that. So first, what do we mean by focusing? We mean emphasizing, underlining, accentuating, bringing out, making salient a certain aspect. Okay, it's not a change in the content of your attitude. It's just attend more to that. The second point about focusing, apart from just this reformulation of the idea, is that focusing is essentially contrastive. So if you emphasize everything, okay, some students they appear to think that all their paper is so important that nearly everything is in italics. So, your attention, I mean, it's completely at the end. If everything is in italics, you don't emphasize anything anymore. The second point about focusing is that in order to focus to something, you have to be somehow aware of the part of the thing on which you do not focus. Okay. So focusing is contrastive, but also it's contrastive for the person who focuses. If you focus your attention on something, you must be aware of other things around on which you do not focus. And the last point is that focusing seems to be more active than entertaining a belief. So usually focusing is something you do. So it's not always the case that you focus intentionally, but it's like a bit imagining. There is a passive version and an active version. Focusing is sometimes something which you can do. Okay, so that was just some gloss to make you understand what we mean by focusing. So now to be a bit more specific, how can we focus on things? It seems to me that there are two main ways, but I'm very interested if you have other way of focusing in mind. The first way is to focus your attention, and the second way is what I call the decisional focus. So what is attentional focus? Is just giving more attention to some aspect than to others. So the attentional focal optimist will be the optimist that focuses his attention more on the positive aspects than on the negative aspects of something. What is decisional focal optimism? Decisional focal optimism is not so much a question of attention, perceptual attention, than on which aspect of a situation you are going to base your action. Okay? If you are a decisional focal optimism, I propose you will be inclined to decide what to do based more on the positive aspect than on the negative aspect of the situation, right? That's compatible with attentional focus as well, but it's a different sense of focusing. In the second case, it's a matter of accentuating the positive aspect in order to act by taking them into consideration. And as it happens, this is a small interlude here, but it may be relevant to one piece of discussion within decision theory, in which that decision theorist Herwig's introduced the idea. He officially introduced what is called optimism index, and the quick point I want to make now is that optimism index is one of the clearest version in the literature of use of focal optimism and pessimism. So let me explain. This is a decision matrix. Just look at the matrix now. This is a decision matrix, decision under ignorance. That is, you have no idea about the probability of whether it will be sunny or raining. So on the column, you have the state of the world, and you have to decide whether you take your umbrella or not. And the kind of the number represents the value of the outcome. The higher the number, the better the outcome. So the best situation is the situation in which you don't take your umbrella and it's sunny. Second best situation, it's tree. You take your umbrella and it's sunny. Okay, it's a bit annoying because you have your umbrella, there is sun, you have to carry it, but still the sun is better. Third best situation, you have your umbrella and it rains, and last, the worst situation is a situation in which you don't have your umbrella and it rains. So now the question is, should I take my umbrella or not? Okay. And within the decision literature, in such cases, you don't have probability, so you cannot make a standard calculation to choose the most useful outcome. So you have to rely on another rule, and there are two main rules that have been formulated here. The first and most common one is called maximin. This is a rule that says avoid the worst outcome. So you reason as follows: you say there is one thing I don't want, one situation I really don't want to be in is to be under the rain without an umbrella. So that's the situation I will be in if I don't take my umbrella, so I take my umbrella. Okay, that's maximin. But there is another rule that has been proposed, which is maximax. The rule is don't compromise the best. There is one thing you don't want to lose any chance to live, is to be under the sun without your umbrella. That would be so good, you don't want to compromise that chance. And you see now that, I mean, the question is, of course, which rule you should follow here, right? And Herwig's proposal is kind of, in some way, it's disappointing, but it's very natural. Is to say there is no clear answer for all agents about which of these two rules they should follow. This is just that some agents, which I'm going to call the optimists, are going to follow the maximax rules. So they will try to have the best, not to compromise the chance of having the best situation. Other agents, which I call the pessimists, equates pessimism and optimism to a coefficient, which he assigns to agents, they will choose the second rule. Okay, and the key point is that what's really important is that you don't change the valuation of the outcome here. Okay, it's always the same fact that follows from your action, and this is just a feature of the agent, whether they should choose the first or the second one. So there is the idea of focal optimism exists at least somewhere in the literature, which is here. Okay, so I come back to the to my main line of thought. So the first distinction I introduced between two kinds of focal optimism is focusing one's attention or focusing one's decision on the positive aspect. Now there is an orthogonal distinction here, which we discussed together with John a bit earlier today, which is you might focus on the positive side of a situation or on the full part of the glass just for the sake of it, just because it is good in itself. But you may also focus on the positive side or negative side of the situation for instrumental reason. And one clear instance of that is that famous phrase of Hume, which says it is therefore a just political maxim that every man must be supposed a knave. So at the same time, it appears somewhat strange that a maxim should be true in politics, which is false in fact. So what Hume is saying here, I should assume because John told me that was probably false interpretation, but the way Hume is normally interpreted here is, okay, you may know that everybody is a bit bad, a bit good, there is vice, there is virtue everywhere, and that we know, and that's a fact that we'll recognize. Nonetheless, when we are designing political institutions, then we should focus on the worst. We should be instrumental pessimists. We should suppose that we are all really vicious, because if we design political institutions that resist vicious men, I mean, so much it will be easier when we introduce virtue. Okay, so we focus on the bad. Look what Hume is saying. He said it is false. In fact, we agree that it's false, but still, let's focus on the negative side because it's more cautious to do that when we do politics. So that's again a version of focal pessimism, which is instrumental and which is clearly not a case of factual pessimism. Okay, so now let me go back to my simple definition of focal optimism. Focal optimism, I said, just a repetition of the definition, is you believe that there is as much goodness and badness in the object in front of you, and you focus more on the good aspects of what is in front of you than on the bad aspects. Now, this definition has a very narrow domain of application, right? Because there are many cases in which, so this is the kind of glass we all hope to be, I mean, I'm not really sure we hope to have such glass, but let's assume that we drop any view about elegance or whatever. We just want a lot of wine. Right? So we hope for this kind of glass here. And it's clear that, I mean, there is not as much goodness as badness in that glass, right? So my definition cannot apply to such cases. Right? And consider another case is kind of symmetrical, but in the bad way. Suppose that everything in the world is bad. Okay? Suppose that the glass is half filled with vinegar. So it's, I mean, not only there is no wine here, but now there is vinegar here. So everything is bad. And even in a bad world, there should be room for somebody to be optimistic. But how so? I mean, how can you focus on the goodness in such a world in which there is no goodness? So we need to make our definition a bit more general here. And the way to do so is to move to betterness and worseness first, and to comparative value. So the proposal is the following. S is optimistic about X, if and only first S ascribes different values to different aspects of X, and S focuses more relatively on X better aspects than on X worse aspect. Okay, so that's just a way of making the definition apply to more things. So the example, so the ratio here, and it's a bit approximative, but I think that there is an idea which we can grasp is, what do we mean by relatively here? We mean that the ratio of the attention that we give to the good thing is higher than the ratio of the goodness in those things. So let me take an example. Same example again, but now the glass is not half filled. There is just 1 deciliter of wine in the glass and 2 deciliter of air. We agree that 1 deciliter of wine is as good as 1 deciliter of air is bad. And now Bob gives 2/3 of his attention to the wine. So he gives more attention to the wine than there is wine in the glass proportionally. So that's what I mean by focusing more on the better aspect of what there is here. And you see that since we have better and worse here, this works also in a world in which everything is bad. Okay, in a world in which everything is bad, but you focus on the proportionality, you focus more on what is less bad. Okay? This is a way of being optimistic in a world in which there is absolutely no goodness. Okay, and in such a world, there will be who was my pessimistic? So you were my pessimistic, Damiano. So Emma will focus on the less bad thing. Everything is bad, but at least something are a bit less bad. So let's focus on those one. And Damiano said, no, Emma, let's focus really on the worst thing in that world. Clearly, there is a distinction here between an optimist and a pessimist, even if they both agree that everything is bad. Okay, and that's a distinction between two kind of focal optimism and pessimism. Okay, so that's the key distinction I wanted to draw. And now the question I want to raise is, we have two attitudes now, and it's common to wonder when we have two attitudes, at which condition they are correct or incorrect. One option is that there are attitudes that lack correctness condition, but normally, I mean, in general, attitudes have correctness condition. One attitude which perhaps lack correctness condition, some claims, is love. But for most other attitudes, be that belief, desires, emotions, we agree that there are conditions under which they are correct or incorrect. So let us wonder now whether our two optimism, factual and focal, at which condition they could be correct or incorrect. The answer for factual optimism is straightforward and very easy. So so that was the first kind of optimism, right? If you believe that it is probable enough that P and that it would be good that P, then the correctness condition for that is the same as the correctness condition for belief. It is correct to believe that if and only if it is probable enough that P, and if and only if, and second, it would be good enough that P. Okay, so it's correct to believe the truth, basically. Complication around here, but it's whatever you take to be the correctness condition for belief, you apply them here. So that's not really what is difficult. The difficult question now is the question of the correctness condition for focal optimism. So the worry is this: how could it be correct to emphasize the positive side of things or the negative side of things for the pessimist? And the first thought, let me start by the second point, is that can never be correct. If you think there is as much goodness and badness in the wine, in the glass, sorry, you should just split your attention in two. You should not give more attention to the wine than to the air. You should just say, okay, I focus my attention or my decision, I base my decision equally on what is good and on what is bad. So why should you give more attention or decisional weight to something over something else if you don't think there is more if you think the two are in exactly equal amount? So one thought which is sometimes put forward, I mean, this is something which has been studied by psychologists, is, as they say, optimism is very beneficial in various ways. So for instance, optimism apparently it raises grit, the capacity to focus and to continue to work on stuff. it makes you more friendly, so and more happy in life. So it's better for its effect to be optimistic. I mean, that's again an aside, but when psychologists say that, they remain very often ambiguous about whether they mean focal optimism or factual optimism. Okay, which, I mean, now if I convince you that there is an important distinction here, a lot of the work, empirical work on optimism will have to be read through that new distinction and say, okay, which kind of optimism is beneficial for the subject? Okay. If it is indeed. But okay, that might be right, but it's not really what we are looking for when we look for the correctness condition of an attitude. Okay, when we look for the correctness condition of a belief, we are not wondering whether the belief makes you feel good, gives you more friends, makes you more successful in life. Okay, we just want to know whether the belief is true or false. That's the correctness condition for the belief. So we are looking for such kind of correctness condition for focal optimism. So that doesn't seem to be the right kind of answer. And so the only answer that is left here is to say, no, but I mean, it's never correct to focus more on the good or on the bad. We should just split our attention according to the exact amount of goodness and badness that we recognize in the situation. But I think there is an answer. It's a bit tricky to formulate it correctly. And this is why I should now move with that very smooth transition to axiological, what I call axiological optimism. And the general idea is it is correct to focus on the bright side of things if and only if good is stronger than bad. The question is now, what does that mean to say that good is stronger than bad? Can we make sense of that proposal? And there is something that this proposal cannot mean. When we say that good is stronger than bad, we are not saying that good is greater than bad, that there is more goodness than there is badness, because X hypothesis in our situation, there is exactly the same amount of goodness and badness in the glass, right? So it's not that there is more good than there is bad. What we want to be able to say is that when there is an equal amount of goodness and of badness in a situation, the goodness is stronger if the focal optimist is right, or the badness is stronger if the focal pessimist is right. But what can that mean? This is the question I would like to make progress on now. The best proposal I know of to make sense of that comes from the philosopher of the early 19th century, Nikolai Hartmann, who has this nice proposal. He said, when you think of the continuum of goodness and badness, we usually assume that in the middle there is the indifference 0 point. I think the 0 point is this. So just focus on the upper side for now. This is how we represent good and bad normally. Right? 0 is in the middle. But Hartmann says it does not have to be that way. Perhaps the balance of goodness and badness falls more on the side of goodness. Perhaps there is more goodness on the right side of the 0 and less badness on the left side. That would be good is stronger than bad. Or perhaps, which would make the focal pessimistic correct, perhaps there is more badness on the left than goodness on the right. Yeah. Right? Notice that this is really a purely axiological claim here, right? It's just a claim about the values, not about what has the value. We are just saying about here, same value, good and bad, that they may be more on the positive side or more on the negative side, right? There are two ways to understand that proposal from Hartmann. The first way is to say, let's assume we have a way to fix a unit of goodness and badness. And perhaps Hartmann's proposal just amounts to say that there are more degrees, units of goodness on the right, if the focal optimist is correct, and less degrees of badness on the left. So the good goes up to 10 degrees of value, while the bad stop at -5 degrees of value. I don't think this can help us here, because hypothesis, think again of our example, we have the same amount of goodness on the same on the both sides. So if the wine is worth 5 units of goodness and the lack of wine is worth -5 units of goodness, we cannot answer our question of why we should focus more on the wine than on the lack of wine. So I think what Hartman had in mind, this is the second interpretation, and I think it fits with his insight, is to say, no, in fact, the degrees of goodness are more intense, so to speak. It's not that there is more unity of goodness here, is that goodness is more intense in a way which is distinct from having different degrees. Okay? And I can rephrase it in many ways, which I'm going to do now, but I'm not sure exactly how to put it precisely. So with this in hand now, we can give correctness condition for focal optimism in the more generalized version I propose. So again, focal optimism, general definition is S ascribes different values to different aspects of X, and S focuses more relatively on the better aspects of X. And this kind of attitude toward the world or toward certain things, I want to claim is correct if and only if it is true that better is stronger than worse. So yeah, we move to a comparative value here. And I think I have, okay, so this is how we should, I can represent better is stronger than worse. So we drop the middle point ID now because we just have comparative values and we want to be able to understand why in a world in which everything goes bad, Damiano is more pessimistic than Emma. And this is what Emma, what would make Emma's attitude correct. So Emma focuses on the best aspect in the world, even if they are really shitty aspects, they are not so bad by comparison to all the rest of the aspect. And Emma would be correct to do so if the best aspects are more if the best, sorry, is more intense than the worst. And Damiano would be correct to focus on the worst thing if in fact there is more weight in what is worse than what is better. So this leads me to formulate what I called axiological optimism. So axiological optimism is a view which is in a way factual, which can be true or false, but it's not about the external world. It's just a view about the structure of the axiological world. So it's the view that better is stronger than worse, or that good is stronger than bad if you want a simple view. Okay. So axiological optimism, if true, makes a focal optimism correct. Sorry, I'm rushing a bit because I don't want to skip discussion. I cannot resist the temptation of just presenting you that, because this is an idea of Hartman which is beautiful. So Hartman thinks that there are different kinds of values, and that the different values are related by different weight. Okay, so the weight of value is a relation between different values. So for instance, if you are politically liberal, you tend to think that liberty is a higher value than equality. If you're more inclined to socialism, you would think that equality is a higher value than liberty. So the kind of debate which we have between different values, how we relate them to each other. Now, here is a Hartman proposal. Hartman is a very refined optimistic. He says, the higher the value, the more the value falls on the side of the good. So for some value, it's true that the bad is really heavier, but for some other value, the good is heavier. So one way to think about this is thinking about the variety of pleasure, pain, enjoyments, and so on. So you may think that the worst physical pain are far more intense than the best physical pleasure. Okay, but people thinking like Hartman, they think, yeah, but if you climb the ladder of the different degrees of pleasure and you move towards aesthetic pleasure and displeasure, the highest aesthetic enjoyment, it's far more intense than the worst aesthetic disappointment. Okay, if a book is bad, it's bad, but it's sufferable. I mean, it's a disappointment. But it's a good is really good. Is really good. It's big enjoyment. So I'm not saying I'm subscribing to the view, but it's just to. I mean, I introduce it first because I think it's a beautiful idea. You have the reverse idea of the refined pessimistic, of course, and it also helps us saying that the relation of higher than and lower than the rank of value is not either the relation between the weight of the bad and the weight of the good. Okay, there are many different properties that we can ascribe to value. Being higher is not being stronger here. Precisely because they can vary independently. There is an exquisitely refined version of optimism, which I'm going to skip. And in 5 minutes, I would like to say a few things about hope and despair. So as I said at the very beginning, there is a bigger literature among philosophers about the distinction between hope and despair. And one thing that seems to be relatively clear now is that we cannot understand hope in terms of thinking that a good outcome is probable. And one of the objections due by Merav, perhaps there are other in the literatures, but to my knowledge, is the first is it comes from the kind of situation of this kind. Christian and Ronnie are stuck on a desert island, and both agree that the best thing would be to be rescued. Both think their chance of being rescued is very low, 1/1000. But both have very different reaction. Christine despairs while Ronnie hopes. So they both assess the probability of being rescued as very low, but Christine is a hopeful person. So yeah, perhaps, even if it's very improbable. And Ronnie says, no, it's improbable. So if you think of it that way, there are striking similarity between what I call focal optimism and pessimism, right? They both assess the situation in the same way. They both value the situation in the same way, but they have different reactions. So one question is, should we say that hope and focal optimism are just the same thing? And that would be nice. We would just have two distinctions, factual optimism and hope and focal optimism would both to the same idea. I don't think it's quite correct, however, and this is what I want to just put as a proposal on the table to finish here. My idea is that the focal optimism, it focuses more relatively on the good aspect of a situation, while the hopeful person, by contrast, focuses more relatively on the probability of a good outcome. So hope is targeted at the probability of things. So if you are hopeful, you are going to see the probability of the good events are somehow stronger, not more probable. It's exactly the same streak as with the value, but the probability will seem to you a stronger one than the disprobability of the bad outcome. Okay, so it's a subtle distinction that I think we can grasp it. So hope and despair are focused on probability. You can agree about the probability of the thing, but you will give more weight to the probability of good thing if you are hopeful, and more weight to the probability of bad thing if you are despaired. While if you are a focal optimist, you will give more weight to the value of good thing, and if you are a focal pessimist, you will give more weight to the disvalue of bad things, or aspects of bad things. So this is my last slide, because before I wrap up, an attempt of putting the variation of hope and optimism independently. So at the top of our ladder, the most positive kind of person, they are hopeful and optimist. So they would say the hopeful focal optimist would think of the same situation. So let me describe the situation. I'm telling you, after that conference, you have one chance over two that I will offer you a glass of wine, which will be half full. Okay, now how you react to that piece of information? If you are a hopeful optimist, focal optimist, you will say, good. After the conference, I have one chance over two to get a half full of glass. Okay, that's excellent. If you are on the other side, completely negative, both on the hope despair continuum and on the pessimist optimistic continuum, you will reason as follows: I have one chance over two not to get a half full glass. Okay? So you will focus on the probability of not having something, and you will focus on the negative side of what you won't have. Okay, I won't have it, and anyway, it will be what I won't have. It will be half empty. Okay, I know you can vary those two things independently. There is a hopeful focal pessimist. You will say, I have 1 chance over 2, so we focus on the probability to get a half empty glass. Okay, 1 chance, and then yeah, it's half empty. And then there is a despaired focal pessimist who would say, I have 1 chance over 2 not to get a half empty glass. So he's in the focus on everything which is negative here. Not sure if it makes complete sense at a point, but it seems to me that there is a parallel and no identity between hope and despair. And by the way, I forget the name now, but I'm sure you have them in mind, John. So the idea that of understanding hope in terms of focus exists in the literature in the recent proposal. I had an exchange with a colleague. I don't have his name in mind now. So let me wrap up and conclude. So this is the small distinction I propose to draw when we to shed light on what the nature of optimism is. We should first distinguish optimism as a character trait and optimism as an attitude. Now, there are at least 3 kinds of attitudes which can be called optimism. We can revise the terminology, that's not important, but the distinction will still be there. The first and most common way to use optimism is to think that the future will be bright, with all the modification I introduced to arrive at a proper definition. The second way of being optimistic is just we agree on all the factual things about the world, but we focus on the bright side of things. And then there is a third way of being optimistic, which is an attitude which we have not so much towards the external world, but towards the world of value, in which we think that for all value, or for at least some value, the good value have higher weight than the bad values. And I cannot see of any essential relation between factual optimism and focal optimism. There are empirical relations perhaps, but that's not for us to decide. But I think there is an essential relation here between axiological optimism and focal optimism, namely that the content of the axiological optimist beliefs makes correct the focal optimist, and the belief itself justifies, if we want to distinguish, making correct and justify, the belief itself justifies the fact that we should focus on the bright side of things. Thank you for your attention.